Welcome to In a Nutshell, the podcast dedicated to all things agricultural consulting. I'm Dylan Brush here with soil genius and ag consultant Bill Brush, and we're delighted to accompany you on this journey where we break down the different aspects of agricultural consulting. In each episode, we'll dive into the realm of agriculture through the eyes of Bill Brush, where consultants like Bill play a vital role in empowering farmers, agribusiness, and agricultural organizations. If you're passionate about agriculture, problem solving, and enjoy a little bit of detective work, this podcast is tailor-made for you. So in today's episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, we're going to be discussing boron and its importance to your crops.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, we're going to start talking about micronutrients over the next few weeks, and I want to always start with boron. It's one that most people either have in their program or have used, and I want to explain to you where it works for you and why it's so important, and the conditions that will make you more efficient with it and make it work much better for you. You know, it's a element that you only find in combination. And what I mean by that, it usually is attached to hydrogen and oxygen. You don't find boron, just an elemental B for boron, out there by itself. So it's got to be tied up with something, okay? And it's hydrogen and oxygen, like a boric acid or something like that. But it has some really critical needs of all plants. And one of those is it regulates flowering and fruiting. So things that blossom and need to be pollinated, all of the tree crops that you can think of, really are sensitive to boron and having enough. And then after the flowering, to make sure that they, set that fruit or nut so that you've got that for your harvest. It's one thing to flower, it's another thing to set, and those are very important. Boron is essential for flowering and fruiting. The next thing is it's required for the movement or the translocation of sugars across the plant and getting it to the fruit at the proper time or to the nut at the proper time. Regulates cell division, salt absorption, and nitrogen assimilation in the plant. There are several nutrients, a lot of them micronutrients, that do assimilation of nitrogen, but they all have a role. So if any one of them is deficient, you have a hard time getting nitrogen into your plants at the proper levels. It also aids in the movement of hormones, and these are a lot of these hormones that are needed for the biological functions of plants. Without getting too much into the weeds on that, without the boron, you're not able to move them. Other nutrients will be important in the manufacturing of these hormones, but boron is the one that moves them throughout the plant. Another thing it's really important on is pollen germination. Remember, I talked about not only is it important in regulating flowering and fruiting, but also now for that pollen to be viable, so that pollen is germinated properly, so that we set the seed of that nut, or we set a seed for a grain crop, or we set a seed for the pit of a fruit. All of those are very, very essential, and they're all functions of boron. And also, it regulates water use. And in a time when a lot of us in California have suffered from droughts, and some places in the Midwest, the people have suffered from droughts, the proper amount of boron can help you with your water use, because it helps regulate it and helps it get it moved throughout the plant. Water supplying the proper amount of moisture to the tissues all throughout the plant. Now, boron, like I said, it only shows up as a compound, which means it's not a cation, as I've talked about, or an anion that I've talked about. And since it has no charge, it's not held by the soil colloid because it has no charge to be held there, and it doesn't really repel itself. So it stays around a little longer than an anion, but generally it moves through the soil. And because of boron's leaching, and it leaches more slowly than, say, sulfate or chloride or nitrate, it still will leach more rapidly through sandy soils than it will through heavier soil. And so sometimes on sandy soils, you need to apply it more frequently. If you don't apply it more frequently, you may have periods of time when it's most needed by the plant when you don't have enough. And so it's always important to understand the leachability of boron. Also, by understanding that it doesn't leach as rapidly through heavier soils, you don't want to just keep applying it like you would in a sandy soil, or you could get to that level of toxicity, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other thing, in addition to you applying it as a fertilizer or as a foliar, is it can also be found in your irrigation water. It's been moved down through soils, or it has the parent material down in your water source that there's boron there, and you can actually be pumping more boron than the plant actually needs through your irrigation water. So that's one of the reasons you always have a water test to find out how much boron you expect to apply during the year. It may be anything from nothing to as much as 8, 10, even 20 parts per million to your water. And that can add up very quickly over time.
Now Bill's going to get into talking about the ideal amount of boron to have in your soil for your crops.
But the level we like to maintain in soils is between 1 and 2 parts per million. If you get down less than 1 part, particularly below 0.8 parts per million in your soil, you can begin to see deficiencies. If you get much lower than that, you can see extreme deficiencies. On some really sandy soils, I've seen boron after the season down, almost completely gone down to maybe 1/10 of a part per million, which is almost nothing. And that's strictly because of what we applied has been taken up by the plant, or it's been moved through the soil profile. So, as I said with boron, if it's in your water, you think about this, you are applying it every time you irrigate. So the fact that you're applying it every time you irrigate, you have multiple opportunities to get it into your plant. If you're only applying it, say, a granular, or you're spraying it on or something like that, you're only going to have a few opportunities. Now, most of the time you'll be fine with this, except, as I said, in those extreme cases where you have really super sandy soils and it's really difficult to hold water, and that water likes to push the boron right on through. Another interesting thing about boron is it needs high calcium levels to control it. What do I mean by controlling it? When plants want to move starches and sugars from the leaf and put it into their nut or their grain, with low calcium, they will go undeterred, and meaning that they will just pull everything rapidly and not on an even, steady removal from those leaves. It'll put it very, very rapidly, and it'll basically give you the classic boron burn, which looks like you took a blowtorch to these leaves and it's just scorched. Anybody that's ever had walnuts with high boron and low calcium will see that extreme sensitivity where all year long things will look normal. They come out, they flower, they fruit, they look pretty good, everything looks like it's going along pretty soon, and then it's time to finish the nuts of the walnut and get those starches and sugars into the walnut from the leaves, and it'll look like in just a couple weeks it'll go from looking fine to looking like you just burned it up. So remember, in situations with high boron levels, you better have high calcium levels to control it, or you will have a hard time with it. Most of the time, like I say, you'll see boron. It exists as 3 parts hydrogen, 1 part boron, and 3 parts oxygen with no charge. And that's where you find it, both in nature and where you'll find it in the soil.
Now Bill's going to get into talking a little bit about why it's so important to stay structured in your boron application.
But as I said before, this is really critical, and I think it's one of those things that we have to be really careful as farmers, because if we're short of boron and we apply it, we get a fantastic response. Don't just apply it again because it works so well. Check your soil levels, make sure that you're not exceeding that 1.5 to 2 parts per million. Once you get up towards 2, you'd better be careful, particularly if you're on the low calcium side, and particularly if you're on the low the sandy soil types, because those sandy soil types cannot hold a lot of calcium sometimes, and that in its fact will basically allow boron to go undeterred and basically fry up a lot of leaves, and you'll see a lot of boron burn. So know your soil levels before you apply. Don't just apply boron because that's part of my program and I do it every year. If boron is extremely low, in other words, and you have really sandy conditions, you can't seem to hold enough, then consider some foliar applications. Boric acid is a really good foliar, and it can be applied again. More times is better than one big slug. One big slug can be toxic, just like it can in the soil. So another good use of boron as an indicator for what's going on in your soil is if you have high boron levels, you don't seem to have any in your water, and so you're not thinking you're building boron levels from that, and you haven't really applied much, but yet you're continuing to build high boron. It's not going down any through the year. Well, if you look at that and also then look at, I have also high sulfur levels, and maybe I have high sodium and high chloride. What you may have is not anything wrong with your soil. What you have is maybe hardpan layer. So if you have a hardpan layer, you're not allowing the natural movement of boron, sulfur, sodium, or chlorides to move through. So if you see these all raising, you have a really good idea that maybe I need to get a soil auger or I need to get a backhoe and see what I have underneath that soil to see if I might have a hardpan layer that is preventing these normal elements or nutrients from moving through. And if you have poor water infiltration, can definitely lead to high boron. It's only going to move with the water, and it'll move slowly but steadily throughout that. Boron likes to be taken up, meaning into the plant, if it's soil applied, in a pH range of between 7 and 5. That doesn't mean it won't be taken up at higher pH levels. It just means this is the optimum level. Again, I'll talk to you more when we later as to how to get micronutrients in when you have high pH soil. There's tricks and things you can do because some things you have a real tough time with these high pH waters of ever changing your pH, getting it down to where you want it.
Now Bill's going to talk about the different types of boron that you can get.
Most of the products that you can find out there are like a granulobor, which is a spreadable boron. Sometimes they'll call it borate. And it's about a 15% boron in the material. So 10 pounds is going to give you 1.5 pounds of boron. If you go back to what I talked about earlier, that's going to raise your boron about, 0.75 parts per million, or 0.75. So if if you are at 1.5, that's too much. But if you're down around 1 part per million, that's going to put you into a wonderful range of about 1.75. Solubor. A lot of people likes to put their boron into their weed spray because it puts it in right along where, particularly if they have a micro sprinkler or drip irrigation, it puts that boron right where the water is, which makes it right available where the plant can get to it. And that's a 21% boron. So make sure you know the concentration of the boron product that you are using. Because if you're just using solubor like granulobor, you'll soon be over applying. Or vice versa. If you've been using solubor and go to a granular, you'll all of a sudden be under applying. And the other forms are boric acid, which is, as I said earlier, is a really good foliar boron. It's very, very soluble, gets into the plant readily, and it's a 25 to 30% boron. But you're not using very much, and most of the time I don't even use that into my calculations for where my soil needs to be, because you get so little of it actually applied to the ground from the overspray. And then you have borax, straight borax, and it's about 11%. It's not as refined as as the granulobor is. So we've talked a lot about boron, and it's our first micronutrient. And I want to make sure this is one of the most important things. I'll probably bring it up every time I talk about a micronutrient. The first thing is boron's not going to fix a thing if you have got poor nitrogen, poor phosphorus, poor potassium, poor sulfur, don't have the good calcium magnesium balance, and then you expect boron to be a savior. Not going to happen. You have to take care of the big ones first, the ones that the plant needs the biggest volumes of. We call them micronutrient for a reason. They don't need to be in very big quantities. We're looking at at this as being 1 to 2 parts per million is what we want our boron. And what did I tell you? You want at least 50 parts per million. And you want it there all year for your sulfur, and you need hundreds of pounds of nitrogen usually. And you need lots of phosphate available in the soil, and you need, again, back usually hundreds of pounds of potassium, and here you're looking at maybe 10 pounds. They are really, truly micronutrients. However, if everything else is in place of those top 6 nutrients, all of a sudden a shortage of boron would show up more rapidly because you have so many other issues before you get the boron that you're probably getting enough because your production's not going to be at a high level. And so the first thing you need to know is know your soil chemistry. Know the amount of phosphate, potash, where my calcium, magnesium are. Know how much nitrogen is held on that soil humus. Know how much nitrogen I'm applying. And once I know all those, I can get a very good chance of getting exactly the amount of boron at the right amount of time. You need to keep boron applied early in the growing season because it will leach during the wintertime. And a lot of times you can't see a field that's low boron. It's one of those things about boron. A little is good and a lot can be very, very toxic. I've seen issues where people said instead of putting on 10 pounds of a 15% or 1.5 parts per million of boron, they put on 10 pounds of actual boron, which is, at that point, and with low calcium particularly, very toxic. You actually had 10 pounds of actual boron. You raised it 5 parts per million, which is 2.5 times what you would like to be on the top end. So you can see, know your product, know the percentage, know what actual boron I'm applying to make sure. If you see something that you're applying more than 2 parts per million boron, you know you're wrong because that's the maximum I ever want to apply, and that would say I have none in the soil. That would probably be incorrect. So always think about that where you want to be at the end, 2 parts per million maximum. And it's so, as I opened up, it's so important for lots and lots of plant functions. But it will supply those functions in mediocre levels if you have the rest of your major elements at mediocre levels, then you won't see a strong advantage. But once you've got your fertility rolling and moving and your structure and everything is efficient, you're getting better efficiency on all your nutrients, all of a sudden, here comes boron to make a huge difference in that fruiting and pollination and transferring sugars and starches from the leaf and putting it into your grain or your nut. It really is a very, very effective part of your program. However, without those nutrients ahead of it in line, it won't be nearly as important to you. So again, a little's good, a lot's not good. And we want to stay where, and you do that by finding out where my soil sample, say my boron level is, and get a feel for how fast I leach so that I have enough there all throughout the year. Okay, that's all for now for boron. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for another fantastic episode of Agriculture in a Nutshell, Bill. I hope everyone enjoyed listening to what Bill had to say about boron and its very important contributions to your crop. Remember to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure to stay tuned for future episodes. And always, stay curious.